Did you know that there was going to be a totally different protagonist of God of War 2018? It sounds absurd, right? Considering Kratos is the franchise, the idea of not having Kratos as the main protagonist feels like a total betrayal of the series' DNA. But during the early days of development, there were actually some very serious high-level discussions at Santa Monica Studio about removing Kratos from the game altogether and replacing him with a completely different character. It's very hard to imagine a God of War game without the ghost of Sparta at the front and center. He is the main character after all. Oddly enough, the developers, including director Cory Barlog, revealed that a significant portion of the team felt that Kratos' story had already reached its natural conclusion at the end of God of War 3. Apparently, there were also talks of Kratos being unfit for modern media. The consensus among some team members was that his angry man-killing god persona was too one-dimensional and annoying to be accepted by today's gamers, who were looking for more narrative depth and nuance. They worried he was a relic of the mid-2000s era, and that players wouldn't be able to connect with a protagonist who was essentially a remorseless murder machine. The internal debate was so heated that some early pitches involved a brand new protagonist entirely. However, Cory Barlog fought to keep Kratos, arguing that the character's past was exactly what made his potential for redemption so powerful. No matter how that discussion went, it's fair to say the game was better off with Kratos at the forefront. By introducing Atreus, the team was able to flip the script. Instead of a mindless rage monster, Kratos became a struggling father trying to suppress his godhood and violent past from a son who was completely unaware of his father's divine nature. This relationship is ultimately what makes the 2018 game so compelling. It transformed Kratos from an angry action icon into a deeply relatable figure dealing with grief, legacy, and the fear of his own nature. Ironically, the very thing the team feared, Kratos' history, became the game's greatest strength. The scars on his forearms from the Blades of Chaos and the hidden Spartan Rage weren't just gameplay mechanics, they were narrative weight that made his growth feel earned. Without Kratos, the game would have just been another fantasy adventure, but with him, it became a legendary tale of a man trying to be better for the sake of his boy. Did I do that right? Moving on. We have heard about movies being directed without a single cut, like Extraction 2, but have you ever heard of a massive 30-hour AAA game that has been shot entirely in one take without a single camera cut? God of War 2018 did just that, and it is honestly one of the most mind-blowing technical achievements in the history of the medium. From the very second the game starts with Kratos cutting down a tree to the final emotional credits, the camera never blinks, never cuts to a loading screen, and never pulls away from a traditional cinematic transition. It is an incredibly ambitious and impressive aspect to attain, effectively making the player feel like an invisible observer standing right next to Kratos and Atreus for the entire journey. What makes this so legendary is that prior to the development of God of War, something like this had never been seen at this scale in-game before. Because of that, the project was incredibly daunting and challenging for the team at Santa Monica Studio. They literally had no point of reference to work on. Most games use camera cuts to hide loading screens, teleport characters to new locations, or change the time of day. The developers had to throw out the traditional playbook and learn everything themselves, inventing brand new ways to move the player through the world while ensuring everything worked and meshed perfectly with the gameplay. This was just one of the many aspects of the game that people, including internal staff and industry veterans, initially doubted, questioned, or even flat out disbelieved could be done. People thought it would be too restrictive for storytelling or too difficult to pull off technically without the game breaking. However, it is also one of the many features the team was able to power through and succeed with. By refusing to cut the camera, they created an unparalleled sense of intimacy and groundedness. You feel every breath, every awkward silence between father and son, and every brutal impact of the Leviathan axe because the camera stays right in the thick of it. In the end, what was once considered impossible became one of the most highly praised features of the game, setting a brand new standard for cinematic immersion. This really adds a lot of immersion to the game, and this is why God of War 2018 does feel a lot different. Now, before we move on, kindly take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you're already not dozing off. You've got plenty of videos coming that I'm sure you don't want to miss. Moving on, the game builds this up beautifully. Throughout the game, Kratos hides his past actions from his son, thinking he might judge him, and he doesn't even answer questions related to this. Considering how violent Kratos was in the past games, it seems nearly impossible that he could ever be so calm and level-headed. However, it appears that fatherhood has done wonders in improving Kratos' personality. The presence of Atreus has certainly helped to calm Kratos down. Granted, he is still quite violent when needed, but he goes the extra mile to be a good father and a role model for his son. When you consider Kratos' violent upbringing and all the pain he's suffered since then, it's understandable why he wants to leave his past behind him. This is largely why he sees Atreus as the key to helping him move forward. As a result, Kratos goes through great lengths to keep his origins as the former god of war hidden from him. However, this does not mean that Kratos won't tell his son a few stories about his glory days, with a few omitted details of course. When the player arrives in the Lake of the Nine, Kratos will start to tell Atreus a story about a horse, a stag, and a hunter. This isn't just a random tale, it's one of the Aesop's fables, a clever nod to Kratos' Greek roots that he carries into the Norse realms. In the story, a horse seeks vengeance against its enemy, a stag. Unable to defeat the stag alone, the horse asks a hunter for help. The hunter agrees, but demands the horse wear a bit and bridle and allow him to ride in a saddle. Together, they kill the stag, and the horse tastes victory, but the hunter refuses to let the horse go, making him a slave forever. For fans familiar with the events from the previous games, it is easy to determine that the horse in Kratos' story is a subtle way of explaining his life to Atreus without giving away too many details about himself. The horse represents Kratos himself, a warrior driven by a singular blinding need for victory and revenge. The stag symbolizes the barbarian king Ulrich, Kratos' ultimate rival, who nearly killed him on the battlefield. And the hunter represents Ares, the original god of war, to whom Kratos traded his soul and freedom in exchange for the power to destroy his enemies. When Atreus asks if the horse's victory was worth the cost of its freedom, Kratos' response is a hauntingly brief, "It was not." It's a moment of absolute vulnerability where Kratos is essentially mourning his own past while trying to ensure his son never makes the same mistakes of trading his soul for a moment of spite. There are obviously some things even the former god of war cannot run away from. The game starts with Kratos holding a totally new weapon, and honestly, it is kinda sick. The Leviathan axe feels heavy, magical, and perfectly suited for the Norse wilderness. Most players got so used to the tactical throw and recoil loop that they almost forgot the Ghost of Sparta ever used anything else. Just when we thought we would never see those iconic chained blades again, Santa Monica Studio flipped the coin and gave us one of the greatest mid-game reveals in history, but it was almost never this way. One of the most memorable and emotional moments of the game comes when Kratos has to revisit his past and wield a weapon he vowed to never touch again. He has to do this not for himself, but to save his son from a sickness only the fires of Helheim can cure. This inclusion ultimately makes the game so much better than it already was, but there was massive internal discussion on whether or not they should actually include the Blades of Chaos. The team had worked on perfecting the Leviathan axe for so long that it almost felt impossible to incorporate another weapon into the game. According to Cory Barlog, they had focused exclusively on the axe for nearly 4 years of the development cycle. The mechanics for the axe were so deeply integrated into the new camera angle and combat style that many at the studio believed the blades would feel clunky or out of place. It wasn't until the final year of development that the team actually started building the Blades of Chaos. There was a very real possibility that they were going to be cut entirely because the technical challenges of making the chains work in the new engine were taking too long. Everyone told Barlog, "Look, it took 4 years to do the axe, you're never going to be able to do the blades in time." Barlog fought for them because, narratively, the blades represent Kratos' scarlet letter, a permanent mark of his mistake and the deal he made with Ares. He knew the story of redemption wouldn't hit as hard if Kratos didn't have to literally dig up his past to protect his future. The designers eventually added a Norse touch to the blades, adding the Omega symbol as a subtle final touch, and the result was the most emotional weapon swap in gaming history. I am already glad they brought these weapons back, or else it would have felt like there was something extremely important missing from the game. God of War 2018 features 9 realms, out of which only Midgard, Alfheim, Helheim, and Jotunheim are necessary for the plot, but the game also features 2 optional realms, which honestly are incredible places to get some hack silver and upgrades for Kratos. Although God of War is not exactly what you would call an open world game, it is still quite big in itself. As part of Norse mythology, Kratos and Atreus must travel through the world tree Yggdrasil to reach various points on their mission, but you might be surprised to find that the gates to Asgard, Vanaheim, and Svartalfheim remain permanently locked in this first chapter. While the main quest drives you through the narratively heavy regions, there are 2 areas that are completely optional to visit, Muspelheim and Niflheim. So how do we access these realms? To unlock these hidden domains, you can't just walk through a mystic gateway. You have to physically hunt down 4 language cipher pieces for each realm. These legendary fragments are hidden inside these purple and silver chests marked with a floating white mask that only Atreus can decipher. This is your hint. Open these chests and unlock 2 new realms. You can actually open the realm of fire, Muspelheim, relatively early in your journey, if you keep your eyes peeled and look for these chests. These pieces are scattered across Midgard and Alfheim. You'll find one by scaling the yellow chain at the Forgotten Caverns, another by boosting Atreus up the cliffs of the Raven, and a third hidden in the lower caves of the foothills just before you ascend the mountain. The final pieces are in Alfheim's organic pink roots and behind a wall of red sap in the Witch's Cave, accessible only after the water level drops and you've secured those shock arrows. Niflheim, the realm of fog, is a much later game treasure hunt that usually requires you to complete a large portion of the story. Only then can you access this realm. You'll need to brave the ruins of the Ancient right under the Frost Ancient's nose, solve the spinning target spike trap at the lookout tower, and blast through a barrier at the Council of Valkyries near the Mason's Channel. The final most elusive ciphers are found on your return trip to the mountain summit after Helheim, and deep within Tyr's hidden chamber while you're working on the massive chains that anchor his temple. These realms are not for beginners, as they offer some of the most difficult high-stakes challenges in the entire game. Their level of difficulty is so high, featuring level 7 and 8 enemies, that it could take players several extra hours of gameplay just to master the trials in each location. Because of this, most players wisely avoid these areas until much later in the game when they have the gear to actually survive. Muspelheim is a volcanic wasteland that serves as a massive combat gauntlet where you have to complete the trials of Muspelheim, ranging from the timed massacre to terrifying challenges where taking a single hit results in instant failure. There are 6 arenas in total, and beating them all eventually leads you to a confrontation with a Valkyrie at the summit. Succeeding here grants you smoldering embers, which are essential for crafting and upgrading some of the most powerful fire-based armor sets in the game. Niflheim, on the other hand, is a total shift in gameplay. It operates like a dungeon. The realm is covered in a poisonous mist that slowly kills Kratos the longer he stays inside. You have to sprint through the maze, killing enemies and looting chests to collect mist echoes before your timer runs out. If you die before exiting, you lose everything you gathered in that run. It is the absolute best place to farm crazy amounts of hack silver, and if you manage to beat these challenges, you'll be rewarded with the Ivaldi armor set, widely considered the best gear in the game for its passive health regeneration. Taking the plunge into these realms is a massive gamble, but the rewards are game-changing. By the time you come back to the main story with Niflheim's mist armor or Muspelheim's fire gear, you aren't just a god, you're a god killer. We all remember the boat captain gag, right? Kratos kills this innocent being mercilessly and doesn't even give it a second thought. It's one of the most famous, darkly hilarious recurring elements in the entire series, and honestly, the level of misfortune this guy suffers just for crossing paths with the ghost of Sparta is legendary. Originally introduced in the first God of War in 2005, the boat captain was first killed by Kratos inside the belly of the King Hydra. Kratos famously snatched the key from the captain's neck and dropped the poor man into the beast's throat, coldly stating, "I didn't come back for you." From then on, this character became the ultimate franchise punching bag, always finding a way to return just to be destroyed or humiliated by Kratos all over again. The boat captain is referenced in nearly all the mainline games, effectively every title except the mobile and portable entries. In God of War 2, Kratos once again takes out the captain after he is resurrected as a ghost during a boss fight. In the third game, while he doesn't physically appear, you can find a heartbreaking note he wrote while rotting in Hades, lamenting his terrible life and cursing Kratos for his endless suffering. Even in the prequel God of War Ascension, the developers added in a reference in the form of an item called the Boat Captain's Idol. As with its predecessors, the 2018 God of War continues this traditional Easter egg in a brilliant environmental way. While you are rowing through the Lake of the Nine after the water level drops, you can actually stumble upon the remains of the captain's ship. Upon discovering the wreckage, players receive an item known as the Boat Captain's Key, along with a journal entry that provides a cheeky meta-explaining of the ship's wreckage. God of War 2018 has a special edition that came with a stunning steelbook case, and it's honestly one of the coolest physical collectibles for any fan of the series. While most players just focus on the digital content, Santa Monica Studio hid an incredible secret right on the packaging itself. Unlike most entries on this list, not everyone can get access to the secret. It is strictly reserved for those who possess this specific physical edition. In addition to its unique and rugged design, the steelbook case is inscribed with a cryptic coded message in Nordic runes on the reverse cover. According to Polygon, the runic inscription is written in Eldar Futhak, a complex runic alphabet that was largely forgotten from the Middle Ages until about 150 years ago. It's not just random gibberish to look Viking, it's a legitimate decipherable piece of lore. Thanks to the power of the internet and a dedicated bit of deciphering by Redditor Wolfstrong1995, the message was finally translated, and it is absolutely beautiful. This is the story of a bear and a wolf who wandered the realms nine to fulfill a promise of one before. They walk the twilight path, destined to discover the truth that is to come. Does this sound familiar? It's a masterful poetic summary of the entire game. The bear represents Kratos, strong, protective, and grumpy, while the wolf represents Atreus, loyal, fast, and growing into his bite. The promise of one before is their mission to scatter Faye's ashes, and the Twilight Path perfectly foreshadows the coming of Ragnarok. The story, gameplay, and character development alone make this one of the best games ever made. But the fact that Santa Monica Studio went out of their way to include this hidden summary in a nearly forgotten Norse language just for the hardcore fans is simply too incredible for words. Greek version of Kratos had that clean-shaved badass look perfect for his revenge story, but when God of War 2018 dropped, one major change was that they added a beard to his face to show how much as a character he has evolved. After God of War 2018, imagining Kratos without a massive thick beard right now would be really weird, especially after spending so much time with this incredible Norse iteration. But what many fans didn't know is that Santa Monica Studio wasn't hellbent on adding the beard at all from the start. That was actually more of a logical, narrative-driven decision that came much later on in the process. In the early development days of God of War 2018, the studio worked closely with its concept artist to figure out exactly how to redesign Kratos for a brand new mythology. There were actually a number of potential models and sketches floating around the studio of Kratos, many of which kept his classic, sharply groomed Spartan goatee. But then, a rough, fully bearded concept sketch came along, and it just made absolute sense to use that as a foundation moving forward. The team realized that narratively, Kratos was supposed to be significantly older, much more mature, and a bit calmer than before. He had spent decades living quietly in the woods of Midgard, chopping trees and desperately trying to hide from his violent past. Giving him a bigger, untamed lumberjack-style beard was the absolute perfect physical representation of those aspects. It visually communicated the massive passage of time, his isolation from the world, and his deliberate departure from the tightly wound, aggressive Spartan general he used to be. It essentially showed that he had stopped caring about the war and started caring about survival. Santa Monica decided to go all in on that design, dedicating incredible amounts of rendering power just to make the hair physics look perfect. And today, Kratos' beard stands tall as one of the absolute most iconic badass beards in video game history. Did you know that you can have the Infinity Stones in God of War? Okay, I'm kidding, but there is a similar version of it, and it is honestly one of the greatest, most overpowered Easter eggs Santa Monica Studio has ever pulled off. During Sindri's family business side quest, Kratos eventually clashes with a massive traveler aboard a rusted reaver ship. Once you take him down, he drops a seemingly normal epic talisman called the Shattered Gauntlet of Ages. If you just equip it right away, it doesn't seem like anything too crazy. But if you actually stop to read the in-game lore description, it mentions that this relic was once considered so unfathomably dangerous that it was shattered into pieces and its fragments were scattered across the realms, to prevent anyone from wielding its full might. Sound familiar? That is because the gauntlet is a direct, brilliant homage to Marvel's Infinity Gauntlet, and it is powered by 6 very specific epic enchantments hidden throughout the game that act exactly like the Infinity Stones. The developers literally created an in-game analog for every single stone from the Marvel universe, and hunting them down is an absolute blast. You can score Andvari's Soul, or the Soul Stone, just by finishing Brock's second-hand soul favor. The Eye of the Outer Realm, or the Space Stone, is stashed away in a secret chamber inside Tyr's temple right after your chaotic escape from Helheim in the main story. If you want Muspelheim's Eye of Power, or the Power Stone, you actually have to buy it from the dwarves using resources earned by surviving the brutal fiery tales we talked about earlier. The remaining 3 are locked behind the game's toughest bosses, the Valkyries. You have to Ivaldi's Corrupted Mind, for the Mind Stone, from Ulrun in Alfheim. Claim Asgard's Stone of Existence, or the Reality Stone, from the terrifying Rota in Helheim. And finally, snatch Njord's Temporal Stone, or the Time Stone, by defeating the absolute nightmare herself, the Valkyrie Queen Sigrun, at the Council of Valkyries. On its own, the base talisman just gives Kratos a decent little punch, but here is where it gets absolutely insane. If you spend the massive amount of resources required to fully upgrade the Shattered Gauntlets to its maximum level, it unlocks 3 enchantment slots. If you slot in any 3 of those specific 6 Infinity Stones, the talisman literally transforms. It no longer just punches, it unleashes a devastating Thanos-level purple shockwave that knocks enemies back, followed immediately by 2 massive clusters of homing energy projectiles. These blasts deal incredible damage and can slam heavy enemies straight into walls to instantly feel their stun meters. You can even aim the barrage just by pointing your camera, and the absolute coolest part is that if the projectiles somehow miss their target, they will literally boomerang right back around to finish the job. It's crazy to think how much everything is connected in the God of War franchise. The boar Atreus hits with an arrow turns out to be a literal Vanir god. When the game first opens up and Atreus is desperately trying to prove to his father that he is ready for the dangerous journey ahead, he is still just learning the ropes of hunting. During a tense tracking sequence in the magical woods, Atreus takes a panicked shot and accidentally hits a massive runic glowing boar by mistake. Kratos and Atreus chase the wounded animal and stumble upon the Witch of the Woods, who we later learn is Freya, who is absolutely devastated and forces the duo to help heal the creature. At first glance, it seems like a magical woodland pet, but Santa Monica Studio hid a massive mythological lore drop right under our noses. Most players completely miss this, but if you immediately turn around and re-enter the witch's turtle house right after she shows you the underground path, you trigger a secret conversation. Freya explicitly names the boar Hildisvini and explains to Kratos that he is a shapeshifter from another realm. Tragically, he has been stuck in this physical boar form for so long that he is slowly starting to lose his true memories and his mind. The lore gets even deeper when you realize exactly who Hildisvini is. As the franchise expands into God of War Ragnarok, it is revealed that he isn't just a magical pet, he is a full-fledged Vanir god. He was originally a brilliant archer and Freya's most trusted counselor, but he was permanently trapped in his boar form by Odin's cruel magic during the Vanir god's exile to Midgard. Santa Monica Studio pulled this directly from the ancient texts. In actual Norse mythology, Hildisvini, which translates to battle swine, is the sacred mount and companion of the goddess Freya, forged by the talented dwarven brothers Dane and Nabi, but the game specifically draws inspiration from the Old Norse poem Hindulioth. In that legend, the boar isn't an animal at all. It is actually a human named Orta, Freya's protege and lover, whom the goddess magically disguised as a pig so she could ride him into giant territory to consult a seeress. Now, we know that the next game is probably set in Egypt, but it was originally going to be set there right after Kratos destroyed the Greek realms. For those who played God of War 2018, it's no secret that the series is now heavily flirting with other mythologies besides Greek and Norse. During the game, Kratos and Atreus stumble upon Tyr's hidden vault, which makes it incredibly clear that other mythologies exist simultaneously within the world of the series. The game explicitly drops massive visual hints and symbols touching on Egyptian, Japanese or Shinto, and even Celtic mythologies. But the Egyptian connection actually goes a lot deeper than just a cool background Easter egg. When Santa Monica Studio first decided to bring the Ghost of Sparta back after God of War 3, they knew they had to leave Greece behind. But during the early days of development of God of War 2018, the studio was completely split down the middle. Exactly half of the development team desperately wanted to base the new game on Egyptian mythology. They envisioned Kratos wandering through the scorching deserts, battling pharaohs, fighting sphinxes, and taking on massive animal-headed gods like Anubis and Ra. The other half of the team was fiercely advocating for the freezing, brutal winters and rugged wilderness of the Norse pantheon. The internal debate was so intense that they actually had concept artists draft up versions of Kratos in both settings. Ultimately, game director Cory Barlog had to step in and act as the tiebreaker to give the final word. He ultimately chose the Norse setting because he felt the harsh, isolated, and unforgiving nature of Midgard perfectly reflected Kratos' emotional state. He needed Kratos to be a stranger in a strange land, completely cut off from the sprawling civilizations, all so he could focus entirely on his relationship with Atreus. Egyptian mythology, with its massive empires and god-kings, would have been too busy and distracting for the intimate father-son redemption story they wanted to tell. The Norse realms won the battle, and the game ended up as the masterpiece we know today. In the newer games, Kratos is much more mature and calm, and even has a bigger body, but fans noticed one thing immediately: how in the newer games, Kratos looks significantly shorter compared to older Kratos. You aren't imagining things, and it isn't just a trick of the camera. Santa Monica Studio actually implemented a massive literal redesign of the Ghost of Sparta's physical dimensions, and it completely changed how we interact with him. If you go back and look at the official character models from the classic Greek saga, there is a minor inconsistency that is actually completely canon. Kratos used to be an absolute towering giant. In the older games, Kratos stood at a staggering 7 feet 8 inches tall. The older God of War games were highly stylized, and the world scale was massive. Because the games utilized fixed, pulled-back camera angles to show off the epic boss fights against titans and gods, they had to make Kratos physically massive just so he wouldn't get completely lost on the screen. The fixed camera always made everything else look small, so Kratos had to be a towering monster just to stand out in the chaos. However, when the series transitioned to the Norse continuity, Kratos was officially shrunk down to a much more realistic 6 feet 4 inches tall. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, necessary redesign for the new camera system. The newer Norse saga games are deeply grounded, because the developers shifted to that revolutionary one-shot over-the-shoulder camera view we talked about earlier. Keeping Kratos at almost 8 feet tall would have completely broken the framing of the game. He would have taken up the entire screen, and trying to frame him standing next to a normal-sized child like Atreus would have been an absolute nightmare. By bringing his height down to 6'4", the over-the-shoulder camera makes Kratos feel much more human rather than an untouchable demigod. It perfectly matches the smaller, more intimate scale of the Norse world. For the entirety of the Greek saga, Kratos was voiced by the incredibly talented Terence Connor Carson, widely known as T.C. Carson. His visceral, rage-fueled performance didn't just define the character, it became an absolute symbol of the entire gaming industry. When you think of the Ghost of Sparta screaming at the heavens, you are hearing T.C. Carson's legendary vocal cords. But when God of War 2018 finally dropped, fans were immediately shocked to hear a completely different, much deeper, baritone voice coming out of the Spartan. Christopher Judge had taken over the mantle. While Judge delivered an absolute masterclass performance that won the hearts of millions, the behind-the-scenes reality of exactly why and how the original voice actor was replaced is actually quite heartbreaking. The reason for the massive recast came down entirely to the game's revolutionary new technology. In the classic games, voice acting and character animation were completely done separately. T.C. Carson would record his lines in a booth, and the animators would match the digital Kratos to his audio. But for the 2018 Norse reboot, Santa Monica Studios shifted to full performance capture. They needed the actors to physically act out the scenes together on a mocap stage to capture their real-time facial expressions, body language, and chemistry, especially for the intimate father-son dynamic between Kratos and Atreus, played by Sonny Suljic. This created a massive physical problem. T.C. Carson is roughly 5'9", making it incredibly difficult to digitally translate his physical movements into the towering hulking frame of Kratos while interacting with the much smaller child actor. They needed someone with a naturally massive physical presence. Enter Christopher Judge, who stands at a towering 6'3" with the broad shoulders of a linebacker, making him the absolute perfect physical and vocal fit for the new, older Kratos. While the technological reasoning makes complete sense for the new grounded one-shot camera direction, the tragic part of this story is how it was handled behind closed doors. T.C. Carson wasn't properly informed that the studio was moving in a different direction. After years of pouring his blood, sweat, and vocal cords into making the franchise a global phenomenon, he was simply replaced without so much as a phone call to explain the situation, bringing his legendary run with the Greek god to an incredibly abrupt and unceremonious end. The first time we encounter Baldur, Kratos punches the hell out of him, and still he gets out of it as if nothing happened. When the stranger suddenly shows up at the door, he takes devastating god-tier punches that literally shatters the whole area and effortlessly tosses the ghost of Sparta over the roof like a ragdoll. Later in the story, it was explained that the Norse god of light was completely immune to any kind of physical or magical damage, all due to Freya's desperate overprotective magic. She wanted to prevent his prophesied death, so she cast a spell on him that made him invulnerable. But tragically, he was bound to feel nothing. No pain, but also no warmth, no cold, no joy, and no taste. He was trapped in an eternal numbness where he could feel nothing. But let me tell you the absolute craziest part. His back has massive Norse tattoos, and if translated, they literally spell curse, which is the most fascinating piece of foreshadowing by Santa Monica Studio. During that epic boss fight, if you manage to pause the chaotic action or dive into photo mode to look closely at his ink, you will realize these aren't just generic cool-looking Viking designs. The runes etched across his skin actually tell his entire tragic life story and explicitly detail his curse of invulnerability long before the game ever officially reveals his true identity. The massive text spanning his shoulders, chest, and back translates to Old Norse phrases that read, "I am death, never to forgive," and prominently, curse. Baldur is literally wearing his eternal torment and his burning, murderous hatred for his mother carved directly into his skin. His back tattoos are a brilliant hidden detail that perfectly explains his unhinged, suicidal fighting style during that opening brawl. He wasn't just trying to kill Kratos, he was desperately hoping Kratos was the one person strong enough to finally make him feel pain again, which he was disappointed with in starts that even the god of war wasn't able to make him feel anything. This one is the most interesting of all. After a lengthy, blood-soaked stunt in Greece, Kratos decided to move over to Norse mythology and live a relatively sheltered, quiet life. However, if the original plans for this iconic character were actually set in motion, then this massive switchover to different mythologies would have happened way sooner. Back during the early days of the franchise, the original master plan for the God of War series finale was completely mind-blowing. The original creator of the series, David Yaffer, had a totally different vision for how Kratos' Greek rampage was going to end. The original plan was for Kratos, after being betrayed by Zeus, to realize he couldn't take down Mount Olympus alone. Instead of just fighting his way through Greece, he was going to travel across the globe to entirely different mythologies. He wasn't going to kill them. His goal was actually to convince the other gods of war from Egyptian and Norse mythologies to join him in his ultimate quest for revenge. Imagine a massive globe-trotting epic where Kratos literally teams up with the Egyptian god Horus and the Norse god Tyr, forming an unstoppable alliance of war gods to march on Zeus and completely obliterate Mount Olympus. This wildly ambitious Avengers-style idea was eventually scrapped, however, because the development team realized it would be incredibly chaotic to juggle 3 different pantheons in one game. The studio decided to keep the game limited to a single mythology instead, ensuring that the Greek gods got the focused, brutal, and dedicated finale they deserved before Kratos ever packed his bags and set off for Midgard. Before you visit Brock's shop and buy Atreus a set of much-needed new armor, you need to take a really close look at the default hunting clothes he starts the game with. Wrapped tightly around his waist is a worn red and gold sash featuring a very specific Greek geometric pattern. If you look closely, you will realize this isn't just a random piece of cloth. It is literally the exact same legendary loincloth Kratos used to wear when he was mercilessly rampaging around Greece, ripping the heads off of the Olympian gods. It is an absolutely wild Easter egg, but the lore implications behind how Atreus got it are deeply emotional. If you think about the emotionally closed off, nonchalant, and completely distant Kratos we see at the very beginning of the game, it is nearly impossible to picture him sitting down, handing over his blood-stained Spartan war skirt to his innocent kid with any sort of emotional gravitas. He spent his entire life in Midgard trying to hide his past, so why would he dress his son in it? The much more likely and far more beautiful explanation is that his late wife, Faye, was the one who did it. Faye knew exactly who Kratos was and what he had done in his past. It is incredibly likely that she took his ultimate symbol of Kratos' violent, destructive history and lovingly repurposed it, cutting it down and sewing it into a practical protective hunting sash for their son. It serves as a brilliant hidden visual metaphor right at the start of the game. Faye takes Kratos' dark past and literally adds it to a foundation of survival for Atreus' future. God of War has some amazing puzzles, but one that caught the eye of all fans was this cloth map that hides treasure. It is honestly one of the most brilliant, mind-blowing meta puzzles Santa Monica Studio has ever created, and the craziest part is that only owners of the physical stonemason edition of the game could even discover it in the first place. It all started when a YouTuber realized that the gorgeous real-life cloth map included in the collector's box wasn't just a cool decorative poster, it was actually bordered with massive blocks of text written entirely in Elder Futhark, the exact same Proto-Norse runic alphabet that Atreus translates in the game. This sparked a massive community-wide scavenger hunt on Reddit to translate the physical map and uncover a secret that was hiding right in plain sight. Once the community translated the massive block of runes on the left side of the cloth map, it revealed a tragic hidden piece of lore about Brock and Sindri. The text explained that the brilliant dwarven brothers actually traveled all around Midgard together to create this great map specifically for the giantress Faye. At the conclusion of their journey, they found a mysterious treasure in the space between them. However, they instantly forgot its location, blamed each other for losing it, and that massive argument is the exact reason why the brothers refused to speak to each other for years. Redditors realized that they had to physically trace Brock and Sindri's walking paths etched onto the map to find this forgotten space between them. The overlapping paths pointed to a very specific location, the top of the Muspelheim Tower, which sits right on the Lake of Nine below Tyr's temple. But standing on the tower wasn't enough. The runes at the very top of the cloth map provided a bizarre, highly specific set of physical directions. Players had to stand inside the golden circle on the floor of the Muspelheim Tower and input a literal cheat code using Kratos' camera. You had to look straight ahead at Tyr's temple, then look at the left brazier, back to Tyr's temple, look at the right brazier, and back to the left brazier. Then look straight ahead to Tyr's temple again, look directly down at the floor, look up to the right brazier, back to the left brazier, and finally look straight ahead to Tyr's temple one last time. If you execute this dizzying camera dance perfectly, you hear a massive gong sound, and a dimensional realm tier literally rips open right in front of you. Reaching inside rewards you with the forbidden grip of the ages, an absolutely legendary secret axe pommel that vastly increases all of Kratos' stats and adds a devastating concussive shockwave at the end of his R1 light attack combo. It was the ultimate reward for the ultimate real-world puzzle. Leviathan Axe feels so sick, and the way Kratos calls it back is the best thing in the entire game. It completely redefined the combat loop of the franchise, giving players a tactical, ranged option that was just as brutal as getting up close and personal. But have you ever wondered why it feels so incredibly satisfying to use, unlike any other weapon in gaming history? It turns out that Santa Monica Studio utilized a brilliant microscopic animation trick to trick your brain into feeling the weapon's sheer physical weight. When you hurl the Leviathan Axe, it embeds into enemies or walls with a visceral, icy crunch, but the real magic happens on the recoil. To make the axe feel genuinely heavy and give it that unmatched sense of magical returning momentum, the animation team actually added a deliberate split-second delay, literally just a few frames of animation right at the exact moment when the weapon slams back into Kratos' outstretched hand. In animation and game design, this brilliant technique is known as hit stop. Instead of Kratos just smoothly catching the handle like a baseball, that tiny, imperceptible pause forces the game to freeze for just a fraction of a millisecond. and it makes Kratos' entire arm visibly jolt backward from the sheer kinetic force of the returning weapon. Combined with the heavy controller rumble and the thunderous sound design, this invisible delay makes the player physically feel the brutal weight of the enchanted steel every single time they press the triangle button. The best part about the game is the boat sections. I know that sounds absolutely crazy for a brutal god-killing action game, but rowing around the Lake of Nine is genuinely one of the most beloved and highly praised mechanics in the entire franchise. This quiet downtime is where the game's narrative depth truly shines, transforming Kratos from a silent killer into a struggling father and turning a severed head into the greatest lore-dumping companion in gaming history. To make this traversal feel alive, Santa Monica Studio went absolutely above and beyond with the script and the technical design. There are actually over 600 unique lines of dialogue recorded specifically just for the boat. Early in the game, the boat is filled with Kratos' stiff, awkward, and terribly brief attempts at telling Atreus Greek fables to pass the time. But once you acquire Mimir, the smartest man alive, he takes over as the ultimate mythological storyteller, dropping massive, fascinating lore bombs about Odin's paranoia, Thor's cruelty, and the tragic history of the Dwarven realms. But the absolute most impressive part of this system is the seamless interruption mechanic. In almost every other game, if an NPC is telling a compelling story and you accidentally reach your destination, the dialogue either abruptly cuts off forever, or you have to awkwardly sit in the vehicle doing absolutely nothing just to hear the end of it. Santa Monica Studio completely revolutionized this. If you hit the shore and press the button to exit the boat mid-story, Kratos will naturally interrupt the speaker, or Mimir will organically pause his tale, acknowledging that it's time to get to work. When you eventually finish your brutal side quest, kill a few Draugr and hop back into the canoe, Mimir will literally say, "Anyway, where was I?" Or, "As I was saying before we were so rudely interrupted," and flawlessly resume the exact story right where he left off. It is a brilliant piece of dynamic audio engineering, quite similar to the one in Spider-Man 2018, that makes the characters feel so incredibly alive and ensures you never miss a single piece of that Norse lore. When Jormungandr, the world serpent, finally rises from the Lake of Nine and speaks for the very first time, it's one of the most awe-inspiring, controller-shaking moments in gaming history. You just sit there and wonder, what is this giant snake even saying? His voice literally reverberates through Kratos' chest and makes the entire world feel incredibly small. But how did Santa Monica Studios actually create a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates? It turns out the secret behind the world serpent's booming language involves throat singing and a massive leaked script that finally translates his very first words. For years, fans assumed that Santa Monica hired a team of historical linguists to meticulously craft Jormungandr's booming voice. But in reality, it was created by the studio's lead designer, Mike Niederquell. To achieve that deeply unsettling earthy vibration, Mike literally recorded himself performing Tuvan throat singing in a vocal booth. But a human voice wasn't enough to simulate a snake that wraps around the entire globe. He took that throat singing recording and layered it with a chaotic mix of heavily distorted animal sounds. The Serpent's voice is actually a digital cocktail of buffalo groans, tiger growls, beluga whale clicks, and hilariously enough, kitten sounds. The final audio track was then heavily processed with extreme pitch shifting and massive sub-bass filters to give it the world-vibrating rumbling quality. In the game's lore, those booming sounds represent the ancient tongue of the giants, a dead language that only Mimir and eventually Atreus can understand. For years, dedicated fans tried to reverse engineer the audio, theorizing it was a complex, highly accurate derivative of Old Norse. However, a fascinating production script leak in 2025 completely shattered that theory. The leaked documents revealed that the first spoken lines were technically just phonetic gibberish, designed specifically to sound cool and match the heavy bass filters. The voice actors and sound team used bizarre, drawn-out script prompts like "Kino no go do seno" to guide the timing of the roars. But the absolute best part of that script leak was that it finally provided the official English translation for what the Serpent was actually saying during those unsubtitled moments. When the world serpent first leans down, stares directly at Kratos, and delivers that massive screen-shaking roar, the leaked script translates his exact words as, "That axe, I recognize it from somewhere. What god are you?" Why are you bothering me? This is a massive, incredible lore drop. It officially confirms that Jormungandr wasn't just blindly roaring at a stranger. He immediately recognized the frozen steel of the Leviathan axe, the exact weapon that the Huldra brothers had originally forged for his fellow giant, Kratos' wife, Faye. Have you ever wondered why they went with an icy cold weapon in contrast to the blades of chaos that were forged from the underworld? Santa Monica Studio didn't just pick a frost axe because Kratos was hanging out in a snowy Midgard. It was actually a deeply psychological design choice that fundamentally tied the combat loop directly into the emotional narrative of the game. The developers intentionally created a weapon that sits on the exact opposite end of the element and emotional spectrum from the fiery chains he wielded in Greece. And honestly, it's one of the most brilliant pieces of character storytelling in the entire franchise. The Leviathan axe was meticulously designed to feel incredibly cold and calculated. Every single swing, throw, and recall requires deliberate aiming, tactical positioning, and methodical precision. You have to think about where the axe is going and when to pull it back. This directly affects Kratos' current state of mind in the Norse saga. He is desperately trying to stay cool, control his legendary temper, and be a disciplined, calculated protector for Atreus. The ice magic literally represents his attempt to freeze and surpass his violent past. On the exact flip side, the blades of chaos are infused with the primal, uncontrollable fires of the Greek underworld. Their gameplay loop was explicitly designed by the combat team to feel chaotic and emotional. When Kratos is forced to unearth them and equip them again, the combat radically shifts from precise single-target strikes to wide, sweeping, almost uncontrollable arcs of pure destruction. You don't aim the blades, you just let loose. They perfectly reflect the raging, emotional monster he used to be. The fire represents the burning, uncontrollable shame and anger that he can never truly extinguish. By giving him both of these weapons, the game brilliantly allows Kratos to literally dual-wield the two conflicting sides of his own soul. You switch from the cold, calculated father to the chaotic, emotional god of war on the fly, making the gameplay a literal extension of his internal struggle. Tyr's Hidden Vault is a gem for all kinds of Easter eggs. There are many referencing all different mythologies, but there was one that Kratos was shocked to see. When exploring the depths of Tyr's vault, Kratos and Atreus stumble upon a massive collection of treasures gathered from all across the globe. You can find hints of Egyptian and Japanese artifacts, but there's one specific relic sitting quietly on a pedestal that absolutely stops the ghost of Sparta dead in his tracks. An ancient Greek vase depicting Kratos himself in his full Ghost of Sparta glory, dual-wielding the Blades of Exile. The visual detail on this vase is an absolutely brilliant piece of artistic design by Santa Monica Studio. It utilizes the traditional black figure style from ancient Greece, where figures are painted in solid black against a reddish clay background. Because Kratos' iconic skin is normally pale white from the ashes of his dead family, and his tattoo is blood red, translating him into this specific black and red color palette creates a striking, horrifying resemblance to the Kratos skin, an unlockable form from God of War 3 that literally represents the suffocating guilt and evil that infected him. The physical interaction here carries an incredible amount of narrative weight. Kratos doesn't just look at the vase, he physically picks it up, stares at the violent, remorseless monster he used to be, and immediately smashes it into pieces in a moment of silent, visible shame, regretting the actions of his past. This destructive act is a massive secret in plain sight regarding his character growth. It is one of the very few times Kratos completely loses his composed, stoic father figure persona over his dark Greek past. Atreus notably watches him shatter it and innocently asks if he's okay, to which Kratos offers a deeply uncomfortable, curt deflection to avoid talking about it. But the absolute craziest part of this Easter egg is the massive world-building implication. The mere presence of this specific vase in Tyr's collection confirms that the Norse god of war actually visited Greece after the apocalyptic events of God of War 3. The murals at the end blow your mind with how everything from the start till the end was predicted, or you may say was seen picture perfect, and it adds another layer of beautiful storytelling. When Kratos and Atreus finally reach the highest peak in Jotunheim, they walk into that massive silent temple and discover the absolutely shocking truth. Faye was a giant, and she painted their entire journey on the walls. Every single triumph, every brutal struggle, and even the heartbreaking reveal of Atreus' true identity as Loki was perfectly prophesied long before Kratos ever chopped down that first tree with his axe. The wildest part, however, you may be completely surprised to find out that this emotional endgame finale wasn't actually the first time you've seen these murals. If you recall back to the very beginning of the game during your first world-shattering fight with the Stranger, or Baldur, there comes a deeply cinematic point where Kratos finally snaps. You unleash your Spartan Rage and brutally throw the Norse god against a massive monolithic stone slab, which you eventually lift up and slam directly onto your opponent. However, this giant stone is completely covered in writing, and it isn't just any random environmental texture. If you actually ignore the prompt to attack and take a step back during the battle, which you can safely do because Kratos is basically invisible with Spartan Rage active during the specific phase, you can admire the giant stone and realize it features the very same murals that were hidden at the end of the game in Jotunheim. Even though the paint is heavily faded and covered in Midgard snow, you can distinctly make out the exact same prophecies. It literally depicts, among other things, your epic final battle with the very same person you are currently punching in the face. If you look closely at the carved rock, you can also see the unmistakable mural of the dead giant Thamur, and way up in the top right corner, you can clearly spot the insane late-game sequence where Kratos and Atreus sail out of Helheim on a flying boat. Santa Monica Studio literally showed us the ending of the game in the first 30 minutes, right in the middle of a boss fight, and nobody even noticed. Everyone was wondering how Kratos would fit into this universe, how they would add his story with the Norse gods. And after the twist in the end, where Atreus is revealed to be Loki, everyone asked the same question. What has the Greek god of war got to do with Loki? It turns out, Kratos might be a fish out of water, a Greek god violently thrown into the freezing world of Norse mythology. But he's actually much more at home in this pantheon than anyone originally thought. When you finally reach the highest peak in the realms and enter the mural room at Jotunheim, you'll find that many of the prophetic pictures painted by Faye have associated names written next to the characters. These are spelled out in Elder Futhak, the historical runic tablet. In the murals depicting the father and son, you'll see that the Jotuns actually refer to Atreus by the name written in their language, which translates directly to Loki. However, Kratos has a quite different name etched into the stone, and it is one you might not be familiar with at first glance. The mural clearly displays the runes next to the god of war, which translates to Fárbauti. This might just sound like a cool random giant name, but it actually has massive real-world mythological meaning. According to real-life poems from the Viking era and ancient Norse literature, Fárbauti is an immensely powerful Jotun, but he isn't just any giant. He is specifically the husband of Laufey and the biological father of Loki himself. The name Fárbauti literally translates to cruel striker or dangerous hitter, which is arguably the most perfect description of Kratos ever written. Kratos' insertion into the Norse lore absolutely checks out in this regard. While he may not be a Jotun by blood, he steps perfectly into the established mythological role. He is indeed the husband of Laufey, or Faye, as he affectionately calls her in the game, and he is the father of Loki. Santa Monica Studio didn't rewrite Norse mythology to include Kratos. They brilliantly realized there was an empty, violent slot in the lore and perfectly slid the ghost of Sparta right in without making it odd. What makes the reveal in the end much more fascinating is how they teased it even in the Midgard house. When Atreus' true Jotun name was finally revealed at the absolute climax of the game, it completely blew the collective mind of the gaming community. Santa Monica Studio was actually laughing at us from the very first room of the game, hiding the biggest spoiler in plain sight. For over a year after the game launched, the community thought they had scraped every single inch of Midgard clean, but then game director Cory Barlog casually mentioned in an interview that there was still one ultimate undiscovered Easter egg left. This sent the dedicated God of War secret subreddit into an absolute frenzy. Fans eventually realized they needed to go all the way back to the tutorial, specifically inside Kratos and Atreus' humble wooden cabin, carved directly into the wooden rafters of the home, were 4 extremely well-hidden Elder Futhak runes that perfectly spell out Loki. Faye literally etched out her son's true mythological identity right into the structural foundation of the house they slept in every single night, and Kratos lived there for years without having any idea. Finding these letters naturally during gameplay is almost completely impossible. You essentially have to abuse the game's photo mode to contort the camera into bizarre angles and crank up the exposure just to see through these shadows. The L is right above where the father and son sleep, carved into the intersecting wooden crossbeams just over a hanging banner. The O is found by manipulating the camera down near the warm fire pit at the front of Atreus' bed, hiding right next to a wooden ladder resting against the roof. The K is pure evil. It is in a pitch black corner near the front door, almost completely blocked from view by a draped piece of fabric over the rafters. And finally, the I. This is the hardest one to spot. It sits opposite the K on the other side of the doorway, completely shrouded in shadows and masterfully obscured behind a hanging bowl holding an unlit candle. Earlier, I mentioned Tyr's armor and how to get it. There is one more that is an absolute gem. Armor is like the most important thing in God of War. While the Ghost of Sparta spent almost the entirety of his original Greek introductory trilogy completely bare-chested and soaked in the blood of his enemies, he has finally wizened up in his old age. Kratos now has some of the absolute best, most intricately designed protective gear that Norse mythology has to offer. But if you truly want the undisputed best of the best when it comes to the endgame protection, you're going to have to endure pure agony to earn it. The Mist armor is universally considered by the community to be the absolute greatest armor class in the entire game, but it is by no means easy to obtain. First, players have to physically unlock access to the shadowy, toxic realm of Niflheim by hunting down 4 elusive Niflheim ciphers scattered in hidden chests throughout Midgard. Once you finally step into the cursed fog, the real nightmare begins. You have to repeatedly survive a constantly shifting, procedurally generated death maze just to collect 9 specific pieces of rusted armor scattered throughout the realm's trap-filled workshops. After securing the rusted scraps, you are then tasked with grinding through the deadly maze over and over again to collect thousands of mist echoes to actually restore and upgrade the gear. Once you survive the grind and bring the echoes back to Sindri, you are forced to make a massive tactical choice. You can develop one of the 3 distinct god tier variations: the Deadly Mist Armor, the Endless Mist Armor, and the Cursed Mist Armor. Each specific set comes with a completely unique set of stat distributions and strengths, but they all share one incredibly overpowered feature: massive passive healing abilities that literally regenerate Kratos' health over time while he fights. If you are planning on surviving the brutal late game challenges in Muspelheim or hunting down the Valkyrie Queen on the punishing Give Me God of War difficulty, forging this cursed set is absolutely 100% essential. When you get your hands on the Blades of Chaos, you must upgrade these bad boys to make them more effective against higher level enemies and bosses. Seeing Kratos finally dig up his famously formidable fiery chains is the absolute ultimate treat for veterans of the series. The moment you equip them, they provide a completely unique, chaotic, and wide-reaching combat experience that perfectly contrasts the old, calculated precision of the Leviathan axe. But a shocking number of unaware players actually reach the very end of the story and realize they are completely locked out of upgrading these iconic weapons to their final maximum level. It's kind of a huge bummer to hit that progression wall, but Santa Monica Studio did it on purpose, so that players find this out by themselves. If you truly want to max out Kratos' signature weapons from Greece, you have to literally walk through fire and prove you are worthy. First, you need to gain access to the scorching, forbidden realm of Muspelheim. Much like the toxic fog of Niflheim we talked about earlier, you can't just fast travel there. You have to hunt down 4 hidden Muspelheim ciphers scattered inside specific purple chests throughout your Midgard journey, which I mentioned earlier as well. Once you finally step into the volcanic ash, you aren't just handed the upgrade. You have to battle your way up a massive active volcano through a grueling gauntlet of combat arenas. These trials will absolutely test your strength, reflexes, and patience, and honestly, they will make you desperately wish you had already had the fully upgraded weapons. There are 5 distinct arenas carved into the sides of the mountain, and each one features 2 brutal trials with ridiculous modifiers, like defeating enemies without taking a single hit, or killing them before a timer runs out. If you have the skills to conquer all 10 of those chaotic challenges, the fiery gates to the Sith and final area at the very peak of the volcano will open. But instead of a normal trial, you are tasked with defeating Gondel, an incredibly difficult meteor summoning Valkyrie, one of the Valkyries you will encounter in the game. If you manage to survive her devastating stomps and finally rip her wings off, she drops the ultimate endgame crafting material, the Raging Inferno of Muspelheim. You take that burning ember straight back to the Huldra brothers, and it finally allows you to push the Blades of Chaos to level 5, unlocking their absolute most devastating screen-clearing runic attacks. God of War's Niflheim section of the map seems to be something of a massive, twisted callback to the infamous labyrinth from God of War 3, in my opinion. To be completely honest, it is exactly what the original Greek labyrinth always should have been. Earlier, we talked about the brutal grind to get the mist armor, but the actual mechanical design of the Niflheim region itself is an absolute masterclass in punishing high-stakes game design. It is essentially an ever-shifting procedurally generated gauntlet packed with crushing traps, spinning blades, and the deadliest enemies the game has to offer. This feels like a totally different section. People on the internet tend to get absolutely accosted for calling every difficult game a Souls-like these days, but the comparison here is absolutely undeniable. Santa Monica Studio brilliantly injected a massive risk-reward element right into the core of this misty maze. If Kratos makes a single mistake, gets crushed by a trap, or is swarmed by revenants, he will instantly lose all of his hard-earned mist echoes. You will be violently kicked back to the start and left with absolutely nothing for your troubles. It creates a suffocating level of tension where you are constantly debating whether to push forward to the center of the maze for better loot or run away like a coward to bank your currency. The ultimate goal of this terrifying grind isn't just surviving, it's saving up for the rarest crafting material in the realm. If you manage to conquer your anxiety, survive the changing rooms, and gather up a staggering 7,500 mist echoes, you'll be able to pull the mythical Azerbane straight out of the legendary chest in the center of Ivaldi's workshop. This incredibly rare resource is the only thing that can be used to imbue your endgame armor, pommels, and talismans with the absolute maximum level of K'tmith upgrades. It's a badge of honor worthy of only the most insanely dedicated masochistic players, and I would be willing to bet that vast majority of the players simply finish the main story and roll the credits long before they ever get their hands on this god tier stuff. Fans think that killing those huge royal godlike enemies called traveler enemies is basically useless, but if I tell you that killing them helps you get a rare armor set in the game, yes, this is right. Most people see these massive intimidating knights swinging around their giant swords and impenetrable shields and just want to survive the encounter and run away. They are some of the toughest, most punishing non-boss enemies in the entire game, but actively hunting them down and ripping them apart is actually the absolute only way to forge one of the tankiest, most protective armor sets Kratos can wear. This armor does not just magically appear in the shop by default. You have to actually go out, find your very first traveler, and defeat it in brutal combat. Once it falls, it will drop unique, gruesome resources. The moment you bring a Traveler's Armor Shard or a Traveler's Grisly Trophy back to Brock or Sindri, the brothers will immediately unlock the Traveler set for crafting. To forge the full 3-piece legendary purple rarity set, the breastplates, gauntlets, and the war belt, you are going to need a lot of blood and a lot of coin. You need to hunt down enough of these roaming knights to collect 8 Traveler's Armor Shards, 30 Traveler's Grisly Trophies, and fork over 42,000 hack silver. You have to actively track these guys down. You will naturally clash with a few during the main story, like when ascending the mountains, surviving the ambush of 2 travelers in Helheim during the sickness, or exploring the frozen wastes near Thamus' corpses. But if you want the full set, you have to go out of your way. Several of them are standing guard at the very top of the isolated towers surrounding the Lake of Nine, like the Alfheim and Muspelheim towers. You can also run into them during the dangerous side favors like the Flight of Fafnir or deep inside the Landsoother mines. If you are truly desperate for parts, they also frequently spawn to terrorize you in the fiery trials of Muspelheim and the toxic mists of Niflheim, which we just mentioned. This set is built entirely around making Kratos an unkillable god, focusing heavily on massive boosts to defense and vitality. But the perks are where it gets absolutely insane. The chest piece grants protection of the Traveler, which slowly regenerates a magical barrier that completely absorbs one single attack. meaning a boss can hit you with your strongest move and you won't take any damage or even flinch. Meanwhile, the gauntlets actively increase the damage of your bare-handed attacks by 6%, which stacks up to an incredible 18% with the whole set. You can literally put the Leviathan axe away, absorb a massive hit, and just punch these knights to death with your bare hands. If you want to truly manipulate the battlefield and bend the rules of combat in God of War, you have to be willing to literally reach your bare hands into the torn fabric of reality. Scattered all across the realms are these terrifying floating dark energy rifts known as realm tears. Most players stumble into their first one by accident, walk up to it out of pure curiosity, press the interact button, and are immediately decimated by the overleveled nightmares that pour out of the dimensional void. But conquering these chaotic anomalies is actually the absolute only way to harvest one of the game's most vital legendary upgrading resources, the elusive Dust of Realms. However, the process of acquiring this cosmic dust is an incredible test of skill. You have to trigger the tear, survive the brutal high-stakes ambush, and then physically reach back into the stabilized rift to pull out the glittering reward. While you can occasionally obtain some from specific treasure hunts or by selling incredibly high rarity enchantments to Brock and Sindri, hunting down the 18 main realm tears is the true path to power. These rifts are hidden in the most obscure corners of the map, ranging from the secret hidden chamber right in Kratos' backyard in the Wildwood to the beaches of the Light Elf Sanctuary in Alfheim, and perched at the very summit of almost every single massive tower surrounding the Lake of Nine. But the absolute most terrifying tears are located right in the dead center of Niflheim's procedural mist maze, requiring you to sacrifice massive amounts of mist echoes and a ultra-rare anchor of fog just for the privilege of fighting for your life. So why put yourself through all this dimensional torture? Because the Dust of Realms is the absolute key to pushing Kratos' incredibly powerful talismans to their maximum level. Talismans are what give the Ghost of Sparta his game-changing active abilities, completely altering how you approach boss fights. By forging this cosmic dust into your gear at the blacksmith, you can dramatically enhance life-saving relics like the Talisman of Resolute Protection to grant an unbreakable invincible barrier, or the Talisman of Concentrated Vitality to provide massive instantaneous bursts of health right in the middle of a combo. If you are a trophy hunter like me, you must need to have this armor set to have this trophy. To craft the ancient armor set and unlock the coveted primordial bronze trophy, you need to actively hunt down those massive rocky golems scattered across the realms. Unlike the Traveler set we just talked about, which is a pure defensive tank build, this highly unique armor set focuses entirely on granting you massive resistance to elemental damage. The blueprints won't even appear in Brock or Sindri's crafting menus until you defeat your very first ancient and physically pick up an ancient heart or a chunk of ancient rubble, which officially kicks off the Heart of Stone labor. To forge the full 3-piece set, the Ancient Pauldron, Gauntlet, and Belt, you're going to need to harvest 3 Ancient Hearts, 16 pieces of Ancient Rubble, and drop 32,000 hack silver at the forge. Taking these giants down is basically a violent high-stakes puzzle. Ancients are completely immune to all of your runic and physical damage everywhere on their bodies except for their glowing, exposed chest core. The combat loop requires incredible patience. You have to wait for them to pry their chest open to fire a devastating elemental beam, and then quickly snipe the glowing core with a precise Leviathan axe throw. This impact will knock loose glowing white chunks of the ancient's own body. You have to sprint over, pick these explosive fragments up, and hurl them back into the open chest to deal massive stun and health damage. Once that stun bar is finally full, you press R3 to leap onto the giant and brutally rip its core out. While these elemental beasts are finite in the game, there are more than enough hiding in the world to craft the full set if you know where to look. You encounter your first fire ancient naturally during the main story in the River Pass, but the rest require exploration. There is a frost ancient sitting ominously near the entrance to the Forgotten Caverns, one guarding the forest path leading to Fenrir's storeroom, a fire ancient patrolling the upper legends of Iron Cove, another frost ancient buried deep near the mechanical lift inside the mountain, and a massive ice ancient wandering near the giant head of Tharma's corpse. Equipping this gear activates the Ancient Seal perk, which stacks beautifully with each piece you wear to provide a massive life-saving resistance to all elemental attacks, including fire, frost, and poison. At its maximum level, throwing this set on makes the most chaotic elemental spamming boss fights, especially against magic-heavy Valkyries, infinitely more manageable. One character trait that defines Kratos is his rage and how he goes into berserk mode. Once Spartan Rage is activated, it is his signature move, and this is exactly what makes him unique. If you've played God of War for any amount of time, you probably know just how insanely useful this mechanic can be. I mean that literally. The Greek God of War has a dedicated in-game meter that allows him to physically manifest his burning anger. When that meter fills and you press those thumbsticks down, Kratos gains fleeting godlike invincibility, regenerates his health, and deals massive increased attack damage with his bare hands or a temporarily upgraded set of weapons. It is extraordinarily useful in tough spots, acting as the ultimate panic button, and is sometimes absolutely required just to survive the game's most brutal encounters. When used wisely, Kratos' rage can truly elevate your playing ability from a struggling mortal to a literal god of war. But the game doesn't just hand you an infinite pool of anger. If you want to maximize this power, you have to go hunting. While you cannot upgrade this particular stat through traditional means at Brock and Sindri's shop, the game does allow you to permanently lengthen Kratos' rage mode meter through the use of ultra-rare in-game items known as the Horns of Bloodmead. There is a grand total of exactly 9 of these horns to be found throughout your entire playthrough, and collecting all of them will stretch your Spartan Rage bar into its absolute limits. They aren't just lying around in the open for anyone to simply come across, however. As with the absolute most useful equipment in Midgard, these upgrades are locked tightly inside magical Narnia chests. To open these chests, you have to solve environmentally integrated puzzles that require the discovery of 3 specific runic seals hidden in the immediate area. You have to hunt down these runes, smash the jars, or throw your Leviathan axe to ring 3 bells before a timer runs out. Find the chest, break the 3 seals, and you're good to go. Most casual players will easily stumble across a few of these items in their first run through the game just by exploring. But if you're looking to beat the game on the punishing give me God of War difficulty, you'll really need to visit every single corner of the realm for this kind of stuff. While the story only takes Kratos and Atreus twice to Helheim, you should visit this realm again to find some incredible loot. If you aren't normally interested in this kind of stuff, I wouldn't really blame you. But amidst the chaos of throwing your axe at all of Odin's glowing green ravens and tracking down hidden legendary chests, it is incredibly easy to miss some of the best hidden details in the game. I always found Helheim to be a pretty amazing, deeply unsettling place to explore. The freezing, wind-swept Norse underworld actually reminds me a lot of God of War 3's first real playable area, the horrific realm of Hades. But in all honesty, the dead silence and the illusion-casting magic make it even creepier than that. Because of that creepy atmosphere and the endless hordes of icy reavers, players tend to rush through this realm. But if you take your time, you can find a particularly devious, easy-to-miss artifact known as a family heirloom that drives platinum hunters absolutely crazy. Just past one of the location's legendary chests, you are forced to climb down the icy cracks of a massive sheer wall. Instead of just looking down at where you need to go, you need to spin Kratos' camera around. Directly opposite from where you are hanging will be the underside of a giant stone bridge. If you look closely at that ceiling, you will spot the collectible helplessly caught in some frozen hell bramble. You have to equip your fiery blades of chaos, aim carefully to hit it, and drop to the floor to get this artifact. Have you noticed why the game has a lot of troll boss fights in the game? I mean, a lot. Every hour or so in the main story, Kratos and Atreus come across a version of troll, which is just a tad bit different. While this is true, and sadly due to the budget constraints, it actually reveals a massive behind-the-scenes reality of AAA game development. If you are a longtime fan of the franchise, you know that the original Greek saga was absolutely legendary for its massive, wildly diverse boss fights. So when players jumped into the Norse saga, many were left scratching their heads as to why Kratos kept fighting the exact same giant guy, carrying a different elemental pillar over and over again. It became a bit of a running joke in the community, but the actual truth behind it is a fascinating look at the harsh realities of game design. The original plan for the 2018 game included a much wider variety of unique giant boss fights scattered throughout the realms, However, the development team ran into a massive resource-draining wall, the brand new over-the-shoulder one-shot camera system. Because the camera cuts and sits incredibly close to Kratos, the animation team couldn't use any of their old tricks to hide clipping or mask awkward movements. Building, rigging, animating, and playtesting a single brand new giant boss in the new engine took an absolutely insane amount of time, money, and manpower. As the game's deadline loomed closer, game director Cory Barlog and the team had to make a brutal budget-conscious decision. They realized that if they tried to build the entirely unique monsters for every single major encounter, the game would have been delayed for years, or the core story would have suffered. To save the budget and ensure the game actually launched, they made the difficult choice to reuse the core troll animation skeleton and rig. By taking that one highly polished character model and simply swapping its color palette, changing the elemental magic on its massive stone pillar to fire, ice, or poison, and tweaking its attack patterns just a tad bit could effectively populate the entire 30-hour campaign with massive cinematic-feeling mini-bosses without bankrupting the studio. To soften the blow of this blatant asset recycling, the writers brilliantly tried to add it directly into the lore instead of just calling them troll. They gave every single one of them a unique name and backstory, like Brenna Daldi, Bridgekeeper, and Grendel of the Ashes, treating them as distinct tragic individuals of a dying race rather than just generic copy-pasted enemies. The first time Freya sees the mistletoe arrow on the back of Atreus, she breaks them all of a sudden and claims they are wicked and warns them not to use them again. While at first players think she's telling the truth, the reality is she is saving her son from the only thing that could break the vulnerability magic. It is one of the best, most clever hidden pieces of foreshadowing in the entire game, and it perfectly aligns with both the internal game lore and traditional Norse mythology in how Baldur's curse was broken. When Sindri gifts Atreus those special mistletoe arrows as a thank you for saving his life, the boy happily straps them to his back. But the second Freya sees them, she goes into an absolute uncharacteristic panic. She immediately confiscates them, calls them wicked, and throws them directly into a fireplace to burn. At this point in the story, we as players trust Freya completely, but she was actually hiding a massive dark secret. She had placed a powerful spell on her son Balder that made him completely invulnerable to all physical and magical threats, but it also stripped him of his ability to feel anything. Balder begged her to lift the curse, but she lied to his face, claiming she didn't know how to break it. In reality, she knew mistletoe was the exact singular exception to her protective magic, and she was desperately trying to destroy any trace of it in the realms to keep him safe. However, her panicked rush to destroy the arrow left a tiny accidental loophole. During their journey, Atreus' quiver strap breaks. Kratos, who is completely unaware of the immense magical and mythological weight of this specific plant, finds one single broken mistletoe arrowhead that Freya missed. Being a practical Spartan, he simply uses the sharp green shard to bind the leather strap together on Atreus' chest. This entire sequence is actually a massive, brilliant callback to the original Norse myths. In a real-world mythology, Freya's counterpart, Frigg, had everything in creation swear an oath never to harm her beloved son, but she completely overlooked mistletoe because she deemed the plant too young and innocent to pose a threat. The trickster god, Loki, eventually discovered this secret omission and used a mistletoe branch to kill him. Santa Monica Studio adapted this perfectly because Atreus is Loki. He is the one unknowingly carrying the fatal weakness. In the final epic battle, Balder violently punches Atreus directly in the chest. His fist is pierced by the tiny mistletoe binding on the quiver, which instantly shatters his invulnerability. By portraying Freya as so paranoid and desperate to destroy the plant, the game highlights the absolute tragic irony of her character. Her extreme suffocating overprotectiveness is exactly what handed Atreus the weapon that led to Balder's death. Although the God of War franchise underwent a massive, deeply emotional identity shift in 2018, there is one glorious feature that old-fashioned fans were excited to see remain completely untouched: Kratos' unhinged, remorseless brutality. Even though he is actively trying to be a calm, collected father figure, having Atreus constantly by his side does absolutely nothing to stop him from ripping monsters apart in the most dramatic blood-soaked fashion imaginable. However, players eventually run into one minor issue with the game's finishing moves. Under normal circumstances, when an enemy's stun bar fills up, pressing R3 triggers a single specific execution method for that exact enemy type. While stomping a jogger's head into the dirt or ripping a wolver's jaw apart seems incredibly awesome at first, the repetitive use of that exact same animation over and over again can actually get quite boring, especially during the long early stages of the game. Thankfully, there is a brilliant solution to this problem, hiding right in plain sight. If you navigate over to Kratos' skill tree, tab over to the Leviathan Axe and look deep into the close combat section, you can unlock a devastating skill that gives you a massive winding charge attack by holding down the R2 button. This move is known as the Executionist cleave, and it completely changes the flow of combat. Not only does this deeply satisfying heavy attack deliver massive chunk damage to bosses and heavily armored foes, but if you time the attack just right against an enemy with low health, Kratos won't just hit them. He will actually perform an entirely different alternate set of up-close and personal executions. Instead of the standard R3 animation, he will literally cut basic enemies clean in half with a frosty blade. Whether it's an average rotting Draugr or a towering fire troll, unlocking this specific charge attack ensures there is absolutely no shortage of creative visceral ways for Kratos to dispatch his foes. Have you ever wondered why the world serpent is already sitting in the Lake of Nine, fully grown before Atreus has even reached his teenage years? If you pay close attention to the environmental storytelling and Mimir's mind-blowing lore drops, you will uncover one of the most insane reality-bending secrets in the entire franchise. It turns out, Jormungandr's presence in Midgard is the result of time travel. First of all, Jormungandr hates Thor with a burning, blinding passion. The two of them are destined to be ultimate mortal enemies. In fact, the Serpent hates the Norse god of thunder so incredibly much that when you first explore the Lake of Nine, you can actually see the physical evidence of his rage. There used to be a massive golden statue of Thor standing proudly over the lake, erected by Odin. But the world serpent was so deeply disgusted by the sight of his enemy's face that he literally launched out of water and ate the statue. You can actually see the bite-marked remains of it sticking out of the water near the Muspelheim tower. But why does he hate Thor so much, if they haven't supposedly fought yet? Well, Mimir casually drops the wildest piece of lore in the entire game while you are rowing around the lake. He explains that during the apocalyptic event of Ragnarok, the world serpent and Thor are destined to have a battle so unbelievably violent that the sheer kinetic force of the clash actually splinters the world tree Yggdrasil. The impact of Thor's hammer against the serpent's skull is so massive that it rips a hole in the fabric of reality and violently sends Jormungandr backward through time. That means the giant snake Kratos and Atreus are talking to throughout the 2018 game is actually from the future. He recognizes Atreus because Atreus is his father, and he already remembers the apocalyptic fight with Thor that hasn't even happened yet in this timeline. The game ends with Kratos killing Baldur and setting up Ragnarok, right? Yes, you are kinda right. But there is also a secret cutscene that triggers after you finish the game. After you finally reach the highest peak in Jotunheim, scatter Faye's ashes, and watch the incredibly emotional credits roll, the game drops you right back into the Lake of Nine to finish up your side quests and hunts down any remaining Valkyries. Because of this seamless transition back into gameplay, an unbelievable amount of players simply close the game, completely missing the true mind-blowing final teaser. If you actually take the time to walk Kratos and Atreus all the way back to the Wild Woods and step inside their humble wooden cabin, you will get a unique prompt to interact with their beds and finally go to sleep. If you do this, the screen fades to black and the words "years later" appear on the screen. Suddenly, Kratos and Atreus are violently jolted awake by a massive world-shaking thunderstorm tearing the roof of their home. Kratos grabs his axe, throws open the front door, and steps out into the freezing, howling wind. Standing right in their front yard is a massive hooded silhouette, crackling with raw, terrifying lightning. Kratos demands to know who he is, and the mysterious figure simply shifts his weight, letting his cloak blow back just enough to reveal a glowing, crackling hammer strapped to his waist. It is the legendary Mjolnir-wielding god of thunder himself, Thor, who has finally come for his revenge. It was an absolute masterclass in building hype. But interestingly enough, This isn't just a cool what-if teaser trailer. This exact confrontation is precisely where the sequel God of War Ragnarok officially begins. By sleeping in that bed, you are literally watching the opening moments of the next game, setting up an epic clash that left the game community screaming in anticipation for 4 straight years. If you are looking for enhancements of pommels, talismans, and armor, you need to find Asgardian steel for sure. More specifically, you need to get your hands on the ultra-rare perfect Asgardian steel. It is a miraculous god-tier upgrade material that allows you to push your best gear to its absolute limit, imbuing your equipment with the literal power of the Norse gods. If you're having trouble with the game's difficulty spikes, having this steel equipped is the greatest advantage you can get, but there is a massive punishing catch. If you are already struggling with the game, you probably won't be seeing very much of this stuff during your romp through the realms because it requires you to face the ultimate endgame challenge. You can't just buy this steel or find it in random wooden chests. The only way to acquire an item this incredibly valuable is to actively hunt down and defeat the 9 hidden Valkyries, and dare I say they are easy. They are literally the hardest part of the game, reminding you of Souls-like games for a minute. These formidable corrupted foes serve as the game's ultimate optional bosses, designed specifically to break the spirits of the hardest hardcore players. Seeking out the 8 regular Valkyries trapped inside the hidden chambers across the realms, and eventually facing the terrifying move-stealing Valkyrie Queen, Sigrun, is absolutely no small task. Kratos, of course, is pretty used to pulling off Herculean feats. I mean, he literally beat Hercules to a bloody pulp in a one-on-one face-off back in the series' 3rd installment, so it's safe to say the Ghost of Sparta has the raw strength for the task. But brute force won't save you here. These fights are punishingly fast and relentlessly tough. The absolute best strategy to survive is to remember that you aren't fighting alone. You must utilize Atreus' arrows as much as humanly possible. When a Valkyrie jumps into the air, I found it incredibly hard to dodge most of their devastating blinding homing attacks. However, you can actually completely bypass this nightmare by commanding Atreus to shoot them with an arrow while they are hovering. A well-timed shot will instantly stun them, cancel their unblockable attack, and drop them straight to the ground for a brutal combo. No matter how much Kratos tried to run away from his past, he simply couldn't. His memories kept coming back to haunt him, one way or the other, and the last memory he probably had from his menacing past is still engraved in his body, which he sadly has to live with for the rest of his life. That massive scar on his stomach is the ultimate "I survived" badge. It is the direct physical result of the legendary Blade of Olympus, violently piercing Kratos' torso when he famously attempted to take his own life in the absolute climax of God of War 3. It is like the last memory the Greek realms gave him. Because the Blade of Olympus is a massive god-killing sword, the scar appears as a huge circular crater on his abdomen, complete with a corresponding equally brutal exit wound on his back. Unlike his younger, angrier days in Greece, the scar is now heavily textured and faded white, showing the passage of centuries. It sits right next to his iconic red tattoo, which honors his fallen brother, Deimos, serving as a brilliant visual bridge between his blood-soaked Greek past and his freezing Norse present. The narrative significance of this single texture is absolutely staggering. The fact that Kratos actually survived a direct self-inflicted strike from a divine weapon, specifically forged to kill titans and gods, suggests a terrifying truth. He is cursed with immortality. He simply cannot die by his own hands. He is completely bound to life, unable to find the peaceful release of death he originally sought. This scar is the most explicit, undeniable piece of evidence that the 2018 game is a direct canonical sequel, not just a flashy reboot. While his tattoo represents his endless guilt over his brother, that stomach scar represents his ultimate rebellion against the Greek pantheon and his tragic failed attempt at self-sacrifice to release the power of hope back to humanity. Santa Monica Studio highlights this narrative weight immediately. During the very first emotionally heavy opening sequence, the camera specifically lingers on that scar as Kratos angrily prepares to chop down Faye's marked tree, instantly reminding veteran players of his dark history before a single word is even spoken. And later, when Kratos finally sits Atreus down and reveals the truth of his godhood, that scar serves as the silent, undeniable physical proof of the violent monster he claimed he once was. The very start of the game features Kratos holding onto a yellow marked tree with a hand sign on it. It felt divine. When you first launch the game, the very first emotionally heavy action you take is chopping down that specific marked tree for a funeral pyre, and as you progress through the rest of the 30-hour adventure, you constantly rely on these distinct yellow painted markings on ledges, cliffs, and cracked walls to know exactly where Kratos is allowed to climb and navigate. At first glance, it just seems like a standard, slightly immersion-breaking video game UI mechanic to guide the player so they don't get lost in the massive environments. But the actual narrative reality behind this mechanic is absolutely beautiful and completely heartbreaking. Those aren't just random developer waypoints. They are the actual physical handprints of Faye, the Just, Kratos' late wife, Faye. Before she passed away, she used her gift of foresight to literally walk the exact perilous path she knew her husband and son would have to take to reach the highest peak in Jotunheim. She carefully marked every single cliff face, every hidden cave entrance, and every dangerous drop with her own golden handprints to keep them safe. It completely recontextualizes the entire game. Faye didn't just ask them to scatter her ashes and hope for the best. She pre-planned their entire epic journey from start to finish. It means that even in death, a mother's literal touch was holding Atreus' hand and guiding her family every step of the way. In God of War 2018, the fate of the beloved Norse God of War is one of the biggest, most brilliantly hidden mysteries in the entire game. Where has he been? What actually happened to him? The game asks some of the most interesting questions about his fate and leaves it as a mystery. Throughout your journey, the game constantly builds up the legendary legacy of Tyr. You explore his massive vault, see the gifts he received from other pantheons, and hear about his desperate attempts to broker peace between Asia and the giants. But according to the lore, Odin feeds the realms, Tyr is long dead. However, if you pay close attention to the environmental storytelling and dialogue, you'll realize Santa Monica Studio laid out the breadcrumbs for a massive multi-game conspiracy. The official story pushed by the Allfather is that Tyr was publicly executed for treason after he was caught secretly aiding the giants. But the smartest man alive isn't buying it. When discussing the execution, Mimir explicitly notes to Kratos that Odin was incredibly keen on seeing he wasn't found. Why would a paranoid tyrant like Odin hide the body of a public traitor? Mimir's dialogue heavily implies that this wasn't an execution at all. It was in reality a cover-up. The biggest piece of evidence hiding in plain sight comes directly from the wooden Jotunheim shrines Atreus constantly translates. The murals scattered across the game depict a massive chaotic battle, and right in the center of the artwork is Tyr, actively leading the armies of Ragnarok. Because these giant shrines don't just record history, they represent prophecies of the future. They implicitly proved to eagle-eyed fans that Tyr absolutely had to be alive somewhere in the Nine Realms to eventually fulfill his apocalyptic role. And as we all know, the skeptics and the shrines were 100% right. Tyr was never executed. Odin was so terrified of his peaceful influence and his deep connection to the giant that he faked the God of War's death, completely erasing him from the board and locking him away for centuries deep inside a secret Asgardian prison. Santa Monica released a documentary, The Lost Pages, which explained a lot about a popular question. Why are the trolls out in Midgard? And if you actually dive into this expanded universe, you will uncover one of the most heartbreaking tragic realities of the entire game. If you played the game, you know Kratos is constantly ambushed by these giant beasts while exploring. But why are they just roaming around out in the open instead of hiding? The Lost Pages of Norse Myth Digital podcast serves as an official prequel to the game, and it drops the absolute most devastating lore about these creatures. Trolls weren't always just mindless roaring beasts. They were actually once part of a more organized, deeply spiritual and primitive culture. But as Odin's paranoia grew and the Aesir violently tightened their tyrannical grip on the Nine Realms, these massive creatures were brutally driven from their ancestral homes. Exposed, hunted, and terrified, they slowly descended into a feral, rage-filled state just to survive. The Wildwoods, where Kratos and Atreus live, used to be a safe haven, but thanks to the corrupting toxic influence of the Aesir and the terrifying rise of the Draugr, men who were so violently stubborn they literally refused to die, the woods became an absolute war zone. The trolls were violently forced out of hiding and pushed into the open, completely exposed just to scavenge the scraps of food. But here is the absolute most gut-wrenching detail. Those giant stone pillars that the trolls are constantly swinging at your head, they aren't just crude weapons. The podcast explicitly reveals that many trolls actually carry their literal souls and history of their dead ancestors carved directly into those heavy stone blocks. They are fighting you with the absolute last remaining fragments of their erased culture, making their violent presence in the world a tragic reminder of a completely displaced broken race rather than just generic monsters. Don't forget to upgrade your Leviathan axe. For that, you need a powerful axe pommel, and you must hunt down the Forbidden Grip of the Ages, widely considered to be one of the absolute best upgrades available for Kratos' signature weapon. This legendary grip increases every single one of Kratos' stats and adds a massive devastating concussive shockwave to the end of your light attack combo. But here is the catch. It is about as difficult and cryptic to get your hands on as you can possibly imagine. If you actually manage to lay claim to this thing without looking up a walkthrough online, you are already a god worthy of one-on-one contests with Odin himself. What makes this secret so insanely cool is that the game itself literally never tells you how to find it. The bizarre instructions were actually discovered by hardcore fans who bought the physical stonemason collector's edition of the game. That premium edition came with a real-life cloth map, and hidden along the scales of the world's Serpent's border were tiny, almost unreadable Elder Futhok runes. When the gaming community finally translated them, it revealed a tragic story about Brock and Sindri losing a legendary treasure along a highly specific, bizarre set of camera directions. To actually claim this prize, you have to travel to the top of the Muspelheim Tower out on the Lake of Nine, which is already a pretty difficult location to reach. The path to the tower starts at the Lookout Tower during the low water phase, but you really need to keep your wits about you. During your journey to the top, you'll be faced with a massive traveler and all manner of nightmarish creatures that will make you want to break your controller and delete your save file. Once you finally clear the enemies and reach the top of the tower, you have to stand dead center inside of the golden circle embedded on the floor. From there, you have to input the translated directions from the physical map by looking in specific directions with your camera, acting as a sort of visual cheat code. You must stand facing Tyr's temple and execute an exact visual sequence. You look center at the temple, left at the flaming brazier, back to the center, right at the other brazier, and then left again. If you do this first half correctly, a massive gong will actually echo across the lake. Without moving Kratos from the circle, you then look back to the center temple, down at the floor, right at the brazier, left at the brazier, and finally back to the center temple one last time. If you input this Konami code of God of War flawlessly, a second gong will echo, and a dimensional realm tear will literally rip open right in front of you. If you are out on your boat and you see that glowing bulb, don't ignore it. Like in the older classic God of War games, players are constantly pushed to upgrade Kratos' weapons and magic to make him more powerful. But the 2018 title doesn't just rely on collecting red floating orbs. It takes the concept of upgrading to an absolutely whole new RPG level by introducing a complex feature in the form of Kratos' core stats. Kratos' core stat sheet includes strength, runic defense, vitality, luck, and cooldown. Normally, there are really only two ways to increase these numbers: by increasing his overall power level, or by constantly visiting Brock and Sindri to craft and equip him with entirely new, heavily upgraded armor and pommels. However, there exists a brilliantly hidden, highly lucrative third option that allows players to permanently upgrade Kratos' base stats completely, independent of what armor he's wearing. Look no further than the miraculous magical properties of the Yggdrasil dew. When you are paddling the canoe around the massive Lake of Nine in Midgard, you will occasionally spot thick glowing roots of the World Tree hanging directly over the water, dripping with a massive teardrop-shaped bulb. Depending entirely on the specific color of the glowing bulb, simply rowing your boat directly underneath it and pressing the interact button will permanently increase one of Kratos' core stats by 2 points. In the entire game, there are exactly 9 possible locations where this legendary Yggdrasil dew can be harvested within the surroundings of the lake area. The good news is that the very first time you travel to the Lake of Nine and push your boat into the water, the game practically hands you the first piece of cooldown dew completely for free, right on the main path. The bad news is that the other 8 are heavily gated. They will require a massive amount of time, backtracking, and effort to obtain, as you have to wait for the world serpents to lower the water level multiple times to access the hidden shores and dangerous enemy-filled alcoves where the remaining routes are hiding. However, padding out the ghost of Sparta's raw unequipped power with these permanent boosts makes the scavenger hunt definitely worth the effort in my opinion. If you haven't already dragged Kratos through the 5 grueling arenas of Muspelheim, I highly suggest steeling your nerves and diving headfirst into the volcano. It is an absolutely brutal challenge that can be incredibly frustrating depending on your difficulty level, but the rewards you pull from the ashes are so significant that they are more than worth the extra blood and sweat. It is really worth the effort and wait. Because Muspelheim and the toxic maze of Niflheim are essentially optional bonus areas, I constantly worry that the vast majority of casual players simply skip over this stuff on their first run, which is a massive shame. While you do have to essentially beat the game to get some of this area's absolute best items, like the final frozen flame to max out the Leviathan axe, there is incredible loot waiting for you long before the credits roll. Muspelheim is not for the faint of heart. You are thrown into enclosed gladiator-style arenas and forced to fight off endless waves of elite Draugr, heavy travelers, and fiery trolls under ridiculous combat modifiers like surviving without taking a single hit or killing enemies inside specific golden rings. It tests your absolute mastery of the combat loop, but if you are successful in overcoming these nightmarish trials, the giant golden swords acting as chests won't just spit out standard hack silver. You will be rewarded with the ultra-rare smoldering embers. These glowing rocks aren't just vendor trash. They work as absolutely vital god-tier upgrade materials that you can take straight back to Brock and Sindri. Using these embers, you can literally imbue your endgame armor, talismans, and axe pommels with the realm's ancient primordial flame. This specialized gear heavily boosts your strength and defense while granting explosive fire-based perks that passively damage enemies who dare to hit you. If, for some insane reason, you thought that a fully enraged Kratos wielding the Blades of Chaos wasn't quite fearsome enough, grafting the literal burning embers of a volcanic realm into his chestplate is exactly the kind of terrifying upgrade you'd need to become truly unstoppable. If there was one boss fight I would have liked to be in the game, it surely is the one with the huge bird in Helheim. It was a big debate among fans that why did they even include that bird if we were not fighting it? Players were used to fighting titans and all kinds of bosses in previous God of War games, so it was only natural that they assumed that they would be fighting the birds and wondered how Kratos will take it down. When you make that terrifying, desperate trip into the freezing wastes of the Norse underworld to save Atreus from his magical illness, you immediately spot a colossal, terrifying eagle looming in the background. It just stays there, shivering in the cold, doing absolutely nothing but watching you. This massive creature is actually a legendary Jotun named Hrasfylgr, a prominent figure in traditional Norse mythology who sits at the edge of the world and creates the wind by flapping his wings. Because of the huge size of this creature, fans were absolutely convinced Kratos was going to eventually climb up there and rip its wings off, but the fight never happens. It turns out this massive tease was the direct result of the harsh, grueling reality of AAA game development. While the 2018 soft reboot is universally praised as a masterpiece, one of the loudest criticisms levied at it was the severe shortage of massive, unique story bosses, especially when compared to the absolute spectacle of God of War 2 and God of War 3. Game director Cory Barlog completely acknowledged this, revealing that they actually had to gut several massive boss fights to meet their deadlines. He stated, there are several bosses that I had to cut throughout the game simply because we got about 15 to 20 people on each boss, and those bosses go anywhere from a year to 2 each, which I think is something a lot of people underestimate. There aren't enough bosses in this game. You're kind of being greedy because while I'd love 10 more bosses in there, this game would have taken like 20 years to make. When addressing the massive looming eagle in the room regarding Helheim, Barlog practically confirmed the community's greatest theory about Hrasfylgr being a scrapbook counter. There are even theories out there that people are looking at characters and going, who is this character? Why do they have a giant bird statue in Helheim? and wondering why we spent time and effort on that thing. Maybe that's because it was a giant boss at one point. Barlog pointed out that knowing when to cut things is central to the agonizing process of game development, and that's the nature of development. As you start to look at its nuances, you realize that there's a place where ambition overshadows resources and time. It is hard to know what to let go of, but you need to get to a point where you say, you know what, this thing is not as important as the other thing. I will fight for this other thing and let this thing go. Ultimately, the team prioritized the intimate narrative over messy, monster-slaying spectacles. Barlog explained that the intent was always to make a much leaner, more focused game to build the foundation for the new Norse era. All the stuff I was approaching, the way I was telling it, the way I explained it to people in the beginning was, look, this is how we'll do it. Simple story, complex characters, focus on his father and son journey, a coming of the age of both of these characters while they're on the road. Yeah, that's it. He brilliantly compared it to the very first game in the Greek saga. There aren't a lot of characters, there aren't a lot of bosses, and that's intentional, 100%. You look at the first God of War game, not a lot of bosses, not a lot of characters, and I think that's good. I thought of God of War 3. I love it, but it's like a swan song for Greek mythology, so there are a lot of characters which we spent 2 games building up relationships for. Now we're introducing Kratos to a new world, and like a fish going into a tank, he needs to adjust. We need to leave the bag in the water for a little while before we release him so he can go free. Given that the 2018 soft reboot is widely considered the absolute pinnacle of the entire God of War franchise, it is actually terrifying to think about how close the game came to being a completely different hollow experience. It turns out the emotional core of the entire Norse saga was almost thrown right into the trash. There was supposed to be a game with no boy. Developing a constant AI-controlled companion who followed you for 30 hours, never gets stuck on geometry, never ruins your stealth, and actively helps you in complex combat encounters is notoriously difficult in game development. When the game was still in early production, the Sony executives and producers actually pushed back incredibly hard against game director Cory Barlog. They felt that implementing Atreus seamlessly into the gameplay loop was far too ambitious, expensive, and technically risky. They practically demanded that Atreus be cut from the title entirely. Barlog had to fight with the whole team to save the character. He successfully argued to the executives that cutting the boy would completely ruin the narrative. Without Atreus, Kratos would simply revert back to being the exact same one-dimensional rage monster he was during the Greek era. Atreus was the essential emotional anchor. He was the only reason Kratos could finally come across as a layered, deeply flawed and vulnerable father trying to be better. He was the lens through which we saw Kratos' regret and growth. Thankfully, Barlog won that massive internal argument. If he had given in to the pressure and cut the kid, we would just be playing another silent, lonely hack-and-slash game with no massive emotional touch. It turns out that Atreus is quite literally the main reason the God of War PS4 reboot became the emotionally resonant, massive Game of the Year winning success that it is today. I am glad that Atreus was not cut from the game, but what many fans don't even know is that Atreus is actually a real person in mythology, although that character is drastically different from our boy. While the 2018 game has been widely loved by historians and fans alike for keeping its Norse characters incredibly close to the original mythological counterparts, Kratos' son is a massive exception to that rule. The name Atreus is not Norse at all. It has a completely different, deeply rooted background in ancient Greek legend. According to actual Greek myth, Atreus wasn't a half-Jotun, half-god archer running around the freezing Norse woods complaining about puzzles. He was a legendary, powerful Mycenaean king. He was the son of Pelops and Hippodamia, and more importantly, he was the famous father of Agamemnon and Menelaus, the 2 legendary Greek commanders who historically waged the massive world-shaking Trojan War. In the game, Kratos actually tells his son a heavily sanitized, personalized version of this myth while riding the boat, describing the historical Atreus as a young, happy Spartan warrior who always smiled in the face of death and brought his fellow soldiers hope. But there is one fascinating, highly specific detail that remains incredibly consistent between the actual real-world mythology and the God of War lore: Atreus' direct bloodline connection to the King of Olympus. In the game's universe, our boy is the literal grandson of Zeus, since Kratos is Zeus' direct son. In the real-world Greek myths, the historical king Atreus was the great-grandson of Zeus, as his grandfather Tantalus was one of Zeus's many mythological offspring. By choosing this specific name, Kratos deliberately rejected the Norse pantheon Faye belonged to and honored a deeply respected Greek mortal from his own blood-soaked past. It was his ultimate way of reminding himself of the pure, optimistic humanity he was desperately trying to pass down to his son, hoping to finally break the vicious Greek cycle of gods murdering their fathers. The entire driving force behind the 2018 God of War is a seemingly simple, deeply emotional quest. Kratos and Atreus must carry the ashes of Faye to the highest peak in all the realms. But if you stop and actually think about the physical reality of this journey, you will uncover one of the absolute most massive heartbreaking ironies in the entire history of gaming. Kratos spends the entire 30-hour game carefully carrying the ashes of his second wife in a small leather pouch tied to his belt. But the horrifying reality is that the ashes of his first wife are still permanently plastered all over his entire body. If you are new to the franchise, you might just think Kratos has a really pale complexion. But veteran fans know the terrifying truth. Back in the original Greek saga, Ares tricked Kratos into a blood-blind rage, leading him to accidentally slaughter his first wife Lysandra and his young daughter Calliope inside a temple dedicated to Athena. As a punishment for his horrific crime, the village oracle cursed him. She magically, permanently fused the powdery white ashes of his murdered family directly onto his skin, so that everyone who looked at him would immediately know the monster he was. That is exactly how he earned the legendary title, the Ghost of Sparta. This creates an absolutely mind-blowing narrative irony during the Norse saga. No matter how much Kratos tries to run away from his past and start over, he simply can't. He is physically forced to live inside his greatest sin for the rest of his immortal life. He carries the ashes of his second wife, Faye, in a bag completely by choice. It represents his path forward, his deep love, and his desperate attempt to heal alongside his son. But underneath that pouch, his very skin is permanently dyed dead white by the ashes of his first family, representing his inescapable guilt, his monstrous past, and a curse that no amount of water, time, or distance can ever wash away. One he is bound with forever. And that's it, guys. God of War 2018. Let me leave you with a small gift. If you enjoyed this one and want to watch another video, I suggest watching 2 hours of the God of War Ragnarok facts video that's on your screen. Click it, and I'll see you there, boy. That was probably awful, but don't watch that, okay? See you in the next video.